Welcome everybody to today's edition of the Indonesia Social Science Seminar Series. The Indonesia Social Science Seminar Series is a global forum for scholars of Indonesia to share new and important research about social sciences and Indonesian studies. We are very pleased to welcome today as our speaker, Jacques Bertrand from the University of Toronto. Jacques Bertrand is a political scientist who is well known to the Indonesian studies community for his work on democracy, on conflict, and on nationalism in Indonesia and more broadly around the world. And we're delighted to see his presentation today entitled "Is Democracy Still Relevant to Reduce Nationalist Conflict? Indonesia in Comparative Perspective." We will be, his presentation will be followed by a discussion by Veronika Kusumaryati, who will be offering her perspectives on what Jacques has to share with us today. Before we get started, I'd like to offer thanks to all of the organizers of IS4, as well as in particular to the Sydney Southeast Asia Center for its back-end support, as well as to the Cornell Southeast Asia program for their outstanding support today as well. With that, I'll turn it over to Jacques. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Tom. So hello, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are located. Thank you very much for joining today. I know that this week and this past few months are quite eventful, and I'm here going to be talking to you about a book about democracy and nationalism. It does seem that, you know, in this world, there seems to be little space left for democracy and at some level political sanity, but let's try to have a discussion maybe on the topic of democracy and nationalism in Southeast Asia, and to just distract ourselves from what is going on in the world. Let me share my screen. Okay, so I believe you all see my screen now. So the topic today is really to introduce you a little bit to the arguments I make in my comparative book on democracy and nationalism in Southeast Asia. And the origins of this study are really to think about the puzzle of what sometimes is called secessionist conflict, other times nationalist conflict. I prefer to use nationalist conflict for reasons I'll get into in a moment, but oftentimes it is couched as issues of secessionist conflict, which is, I think, an important subset of what we commonly in political science like to talk about as ethnic conflict, that I think is crucially different. And this came about really by thinking about how common it is, first of all, in Asia more broadly, that we have these kinds of conflicts. They are quite persistent. This map shows just a subset of some more important ones that I classify here as nationalist. They are characterized by violent conflict. They occur in democratic and in authoritarian settings, and they're quite persistent. The key questions that I've been trying to address in this book are, does democracy tend to reduce or exacerbate nationalist conflicts? And what explains the variance in conflict outcomes? The key debates that in political science we've had for several decades now, including in what is now a very conflicted region where democracy seems to not exist anymore, or very little in the post-Soviet space these days, is the question of, does democracy increase or reduce violence? And a lot of this had to do with understanding whether periods of democratization led to a rise in nationalist conflicts and violence, which was quite common in the post-Soviet space, or whether at some level democracy tends to reduce the chances that you get this kind of conflict, and there are mechanisms at place that will kick in to produce and resolve conflict. Now, what important distinction I make in the book and discussion that I have is to really make a distinction in what oftentimes in the literature has been an overemphasis on violence and not enough on other expressions of conflict. And there's a bit of a gap between a lot of studies that study conflict and equate it with basically violence. And then there are those who then assume absence of violence means absence of conflict. I think there's a space here to be studying conflict that is not quite normalized in democratic settings, but also is still deeply seated, but not necessarily violent. And that is a lot of what I address in the book as well. I'm going very, very fast over this part, but this is because I'm getting to the Indonesia component soon, putting you into the frame of mind of the broader book. The argument that I have, basically the one big picture argument here is that Southeast Asian cases do show that democracy over time does indeed reduce violent outcomes. So there's a good news story here when we try to take comparatively across different cases. However, there are two caveats that are important here. The first is that in the short term, indeed, in many cases, we have seen spikes because of what I would say are conditions of uncertainty in initial periods of democracy. And that uncertainty feeds, therefore, in certain mechanisms that kick in to lead to the rise of violent conflict, violent nationalist conflict. And then over time, although violence does tend to subside, I do see in many, many cases that conflict often remains deep. And that's a really important point, that once we see the absence of violence, it does not mean that conflict has disappeared, nor has it necessarily been normalized. What I mean by normalized, that integrated to normal democratic procedures. So that remains, highly problematic for many of the conflicts in the region. So the book more broadly and comparatively looks at 5 groups that had, in my mind, similar structures and initial trajectories. They're the Acehnese, Papuans, Moros, Cordillerans, Malay Muslims in Thailand. They all shared less than 4% of the population, territorially concentrated, and all had violent mobilization under authoritarian rule. So the starting point in some ways comparatively is pretty similar. For today's presentation, given this audience and this well-informed audience, of course, on Indonesia, I'm going to be focusing on Aceh and Papua to give you a sense of how these 2 cases work, or at least how I analyze them within the context of this broader argument and broader book. Now, an important point I make in the book, and I think that's been underemphasized in much of the literature that has looked at conflict in this context, is that nationalist violence, in my mind, is different from other kinds of what we commonly call ethnic conflict. And it's different in what I characterize as nationalists are these conflicts that really strike at the core of state sovereignty. And because of this, they deeply challenge the state just by the fact of making the kinds of grievances, expressing the kinds of grievances they have, and making the claims that they have on autonomy, on control over territory, or other kinds of demands they make. So it's hard, very difficult to bridge this gap between the objectives that the nationalists have and what the state is willing to concede. And that is a sort of a background condition that runs through all of these cases, whether in democratic or in authoritarian settings. Nevertheless, I do, in the book, sort of show and discuss how democracy in the end does tend to reduce violence. And it does so for reasons that we would expect democracy to work effectively, which is that it increases channels of mobilization. So in all cases where you do have a certain period of democracy, there are channels of mobilization that can occur, the spaces for mobilization that didn't exist before. Secondly, it dilutes the claims to national group representation. That's another aspect that oftentimes is seen, can have 2 sides to it. That it opens up to more claims to representing the group, which means, of course, that the group becomes divided into different components of the elite that are claiming to represent the group, and therefore it does tend to reduce violence because they are more diluted in their objectives and their methods of seeking group representation and group claims. The third is that it increases the cost of violence over time. That the positive aspects of democratic institutions are that for both sides, violence becomes much more visible, much more clear, And then there's a cost in a democratic setting to continue to inflict violence, whether it's the state or whether it is the mobilized insurgent groups, for instance. And so there is a tendency to seek mobilizational tools that are different than using violence. So what I tend to, the way the book is structured is to try to track through these 5 different cases, 2 stages in what I see as a democracy's impact. So I look at 2 initial stages, an initial stage and then a second stage I call democratic stability. And I track over time what tends to be the trajectories of mobilization and state response when you have democratization. So in the initial stages of democracy, the points that I tend to emphasize are the uncertainty that sets in at the moment of democratic opening, that the groups are claiming certain representation, certain forms of either autonomy, independence, or territorial control, and they have no idea how the democratic state is going to respond to those longstanding claims that they've often made violently under authoritarian regimes. It opens up opportunities for negotiation. So there's an expectation that negotiation will happen at the moment of democratic opening, and it sets the terrain for the state to signal compromise, and this is important. And the state has a brief but significant opportunity to signal compromise at the initial stage. Later stages in what I call democratic stability are at a moment at which, at that point, the institutions are set. Constitutional modifications have been made. There's legislation that is recognizing what the state is willing to put into place in terms of decentralization or autonomy or things. And they alter, therefore, the parameters of group mobilization. At that point, groups know where they stand, at least within that new kind of institutional framework, and that changes the way in which they mobilize. So I'm going very fast over this just to put you into the frame of mind of the book. This may be a little take more than 30 seconds to sort of work it out. But I just want to point out that the book generally, for those who are political scientists in the audience, which is a minority, I'm sure, those who know this literature will know that there has been in the literature an argument made that there was a U-curve hypothesis that conflict tends to rise after democratic opening and then decline rapidly afterwards. I modify this and test. I mean, it's essentially looking at how well my own hypothesis generally would, or the cases would illustrate what I see as a bell curve kind of tendency. And the 2 tails are a little bit more softened up because I think there's something important that happens at the 2 sides. One is originally, like I said, an opportunity for negotiation and state concessions early on that can prevent violent mobilization. And at the other tail end is this sort of, when you see an absence of violence, conflict oftentimes remains deep, and therefore it doesn't quite disappear. And that's the significance of this curve. I'm happy to go into some more detail if you'd like. So what explains, therefore, when I look at these five cases, I zone into 5 factors. The first one is mobilizational capacity. That's a sort of basic structural difference between the groups. If they don't have the capacity to mobilize, we won't expect to have a whole lot of violence. The second is what I was just mentioning. State concessions in the transitional stage are really key. Those states that at the moment of democratic opening come out with some state concessions that are significant quite early can tend to prevent that sort of upward sloping violence that happens in many cases when there is high capacity. Electoral coalitions that are supportive of concessions are key, and you see a shift in Southeast Asian cases in terms of where electoral interests appear to be, and I'll get into that a little bit in the case of Aceh in particular. In the broader book, a contrast between the Philippines and Indonesia point to the importance of presidential systems that have independent parliaments that become much, much more challenging, but I won't address this today. And then this important point about credibility of commitments, which is an argument made, I'm happy to go into it more extensively later, but the idea here is that democracy in itself does help to increase credibility of commitment. But in the book, I make the point that only when institutions close door for evading those commitments, and there are ways in which institutions can really increase that credibility. And we see that particularly in the case of Aceh, and that's something I will emphasize in relation to Papua. So I'm reversing a little bit the order here, in part because I'm very happy to have Veronika comment. So I want to spend a little bit more time on Papua here. And so in the book, I trace again what I see as the analysis of change from authoritarian to democratic period. So in the Papuan case, the starting point, very familiar to most of you, during the Suharto regime, the grievances were established. They were very deep. It starts with the 1969 Act of Free Choice that becomes contested and becomes the basis for grievances in Papua until today. There is, of course, deep inequality, resource exploitation around Freeport-McMoRan, natural resources, increasing migration from the rest of Indonesia that just creates greater and greater inequality in Papua and resentment. What we see setting in to Papua during this period is low-level violence, much of it state-led, in part because, of course, the resistance to the Suharto regime revolves mainly around the role of the OPM, the Organisasi Papua Merdeka, which is, in the end, not very capable of creating a strong, united umbrella organization with significant capacity to mount resistance to the state. The democratic period that starts after 1998, you have an initial lull in violence. And this is, to me, significant in comparative terms. It is this moment in which you did actually have state signaling that was significant in terms of opening up to possibilities of negotiation and possibilities of change and reform, which creates an incentive for Papuans to mobilize in a nonviolent way. So you have the organizations of two large congresses with 500,000 people each. They create their own leadership around the PDP. And this was in part initially, in part with Habibie, mostly with Wahid, being tolerant to things such as the rise of the Morning Star flag, allowing these congresses to occur, even visiting and recognizing some role for the PDP initially. This backfires. Wahid has to turn 180 degrees after being criticized in the NPR after 2000. There are several incidents then of rise of repression from the state, and Wahid, ends up having to change completely his approach and start repressing as well, or allowing the oppression of the Papuan elite and the mobilization that had been occurring. In some ways, the book goes into how the trajectory is explained in part by this low mobilizational capacity of the OPM or others. Early state concessions were important, but they were followed by a curtailing of the Papuan elite and a limiting of accommodation of nationalists. And so the important point here is that what we see, therefore, is, yes, a rise in violence, mostly state-led, but of course it doesn't lead to a huge spike of violence, but the conflict remains quite deep. What happens with democratic stabilization? And here I characterize in Indonesia democratic stabilization mostly after 2002, in part because I find that after 2002, the constitutional amendments were put into place. Megawati's government and the PDIP majority were firmly entrenched. The military was recognizing the role of civilians. There was a little more stability in the relationship between the executive and the military at this point. And so this is the period that I consider to be democratic stabilization. There were limits at that point, clear limits of what autonomy could be institutionalized. In Papua, this means passing the special autonomy bill and putting in and having it begin in 2002. The repressive capacity was limited, but still deployed to prevent secessionists. So at this point, you see a clear turn, clamping down on the PDP, not allowing essentially the reconstituting of a united Papuan leadership. Now, some of this, of course, becomes undermined by Papuans themselves, in that you have a lot of new groups seeking to replace the PDP leadership, whether it's the churches, whether it's the customary council, which takes on a leading role, or attempts to take on a leading role, and including when one of its leaders, Forcorus, wants to declare himself president of Papua, which was the end, of course, of the significant role of the customary council at this point. And then you had other groups that were competing as well. So you have a divided mobilization occurring, and the state having repressed the PDP, which simply dilutes the capacity for mobilization to reoccur. The parliament supported limits on Papuan mobilization. There's a strong elite consensus in government to not basically concede more than what had been conceded in special autonomy. And this becomes quite evident throughout even the SBY period, by contrast to Aceh. The impact is continued low-level violence, mobilizational capacity remained limited, division was enhanced. The book goes into other aspects of division, which is state-led undermining of what had been conceded. You concede autonomy. At the same time, the government divided the province of Papua into two, undermined the role of what was a Papuan specific institution, the Majelis Papua Rakyat, and the MPR, and the undermining of that institution, of course, simply leads to more division, while you have at the same time a recognition of autonomy on the other hand. So it tends to contradict to some extent. So the conclusion of this is that the credibility of the commitment made by the state was low, given that it was a non-negotiated status for special autonomy, and was combined with undermining the MRP, the Majelis Rakyat Papua, the MRP, and the implementation of special autonomy. So key points here, just analytically: low mobilizational capacity in terms of the OPM, state concessions were limited under Wahid, allowed under civilian movement to rise. Electoral coalitions were mostly against concessions, and the credibility of commitments here was low because of lack of negotiated status. So that's just a bird's eye view, I suppose, of what I do with Papua. Let me give you even more of a bird's eye view, because I'm aware of the very short period that we have in this webinar, but give you an idea of how I contrast this with Aceh. So Aceh, again, very familiar story to most of you. During the Suharto regime, the grievances are based on regional discrimination, lack of resource sharing, and later repression against civilians and mobilization that occurs under GAM. That does lead to significant periods of mobilization, 76, 89 of GAM, and then later. Democratization, you have an initial period of civilian mobilization followed by violence escalation. This is very key. There was a moment in which there was civilian mobilization that was allowed, that was even listened to some extent. GAM was in the background. There was an opportunity for the state to make concessions. It backfired because the initial concessions were really not credible in terms of what they were, in terms of responding to grievances. Extending Islam to the region was not what basically most Acehnese were looking for, certainly not GAM. Slow opening to autonomy and allowing mass mobilization for a referendum. They allowed it for a while, and of course did not allow any kind of referendum to occur. So there was very small amount of concessions, but you see this period where the opportunity was missed, and then GAM just started to mobilize, and you get that familiar spike in violence that's created by the uncertainty of how the Aceh question was going to be settled. The electoral coalitions here, very interesting as well, against offering concessions. Habibie was criticized for his handling of East Timor, which reduces the opportunity for any referendum in Aceh or even Papua. Wahid, initially open again to Aceh, very conciliatory, is rebuked directly in the MPR for his handling of secessionists. So he has to turn and become much more repressive in Aceh and in Papua. Later, things change a little bit. GUM re-escalates and has the mobilization to do so. So what we have here is basically a new space that allowed mobilization, but high uncertainty over outcomes and state concessions that really thwarted the initial violence, but not for very long. The coalition at this point posed limits to concessions and send signals of no compromise for secessionists. So that does become one of the reasons why you get this kind of spike in Aceh. At this point, no credibility of the commitment to autonomy. It fell through completely. By the time they put special autonomy on in Aceh, it's completely undermined, and most Achenese agreed at this point that there was going to be no significance to this special autonomy bill, even though in substance and legally, it actually had a lot of power to it. Democratic stability, the parameters changed. The parameters of uncertainty were closed. You had the final constitutional amendments in place, PDIP, strong nationalist reaffirmation, as I said, high mobilizational capacity. This is the height of when GUM has escalated and continues to resist the state. The negotiated agreement leading to the law on Aceh in 2006 is what I emphasize in the book, of course. There's something very interesting here that happens that changes the parameters. It is an extensive and detailed agreement. I emphasize the key role that Yusuf Kala played under SBY and SBY as well, shifting here the electoral interests. There was something really interesting that happened in terms of SBY and Kala projecting themselves as peacemakers and wanting to settle with what was essentially a response to criticism again. Now at this point, shifting sentiment in the MPR and in the parliament about criticizing the high degree of repression of the armed forces against Muslim brethren. So this was very, very important in terms of changing that kind of approach to Aceh. It allowed the ability to breach the agreement, and most importantly, contrasting to the Moros, the ability to translate the peace agreement into law that was with very, very few changes, which is what I point to in the book as being an important role of having parliaments that are essentially aligned with executive prerogatives or executive priorities. Okay, so the key points here are essentially, if we contrast to Papua, the structural features, mobilization capacity remains high. State concessions were important initially, but not sufficient, and therefore explains much of the rise in the violence. Electoral coalitions were, again, this shift was important from first being critical of accommodating separatists to suddenly the degree of violence and the transparency in the violence, right? This is what's different under democratic settings. Having so many ability to monitor this violence becomes a source of then criticizing the government and therefore reducing the ability to continue a highly repressive approach in Aceh, which leads and opens up the door for this law in Aceh. Notice I didn't mention the tsunami, happy to come back to it later. And then the strong executive control over parliament is key in making this law. So democracy in both cases reduces the ability to sustain repressive policies, at least without higher degree of scrutiny. It does open up opportunities for negotiation and state concessions. And I think this cannot happen under a non-democratic government, at least not in a credible way. And then it creates more credible environments for representation, and something I haven't really mentioned in this presentation, but is there in the book in terms of, Papuans did gain some representation. Of course, they gained some representation in government, and especially in Papua itself. They gained even some, at least token, symbolic cabinet positions. They had positions in the PDP. So democracy does work to gain some representation. The question is whether it is sufficient in terms of addressing the kinds of grievances that the group has. What explains different outcomes? Some structural features are inevitable. when we look across cases, of course, if there are different strength of nationalist organizations, we're not likely going to see a equivalent kind of type of mobilization, and certainly not when we're measuring in terms of violence. And this is important then to me, that it's not sufficient to just focus on violence when we think about these deep conflicts, because too much of it has to do with violent capacity to project violently rather than the depth of grievances that are oftentimes there. Strong electoral or political incentives were key in the agreement in Aceh after initial criticisms conceding to secessionists. But the combination of criticism at a high degree of violence, Kala's and SBY's political interest, the ability to pass the agreement in parliament was key. None of these were present in Papua. You get a special autonomy bill that has none of those features, none of those political interests behind it. And that creates, in many ways, a very significant difference in terms of credibility, what I call credibility of commitment. High in Aceh because it was a negotiated agreement and detailed legislation that does create a certain number of guarantees for the Acehnese that for Papuans, even though, and I didn't get into the details, special autonomy is very generous. It's provided a lot in legal terms, but never got the investment by Papuans, in part because they couldn't participate in the design of it in any way. And there were many reasons why this undermined the agreement itself. So the constitutional legal support for autonomy was gained, but it undermined by the lack of involvement, design, and divisive policy. So wrapping up, the broader book and these cases essentially look at what I see as democratic dividends more broadly. There are other conclusions, but these are the ones I'm emphasizing just in the presentation, that repression from violent suppression obviously tends to, and assimilationist policies only reduce violence temporarily. So we can see a reduction in violence at times, but it fuels rather than eliminates grievances. I think that's not a very controversial statement. Democratic governments often make effective concessions with short-term gains, but the uncertainty at times of transition really creates volatility. Signaling compromise is key. And I think this is an important difference with some of the literature out there in terms of that moment where these concessions can really attenuate the spike in violence. And Southeast Asian cases have seen those possibilities. Nationalist conflicts, though, when we think about conflict as being nationalist, they have deep differences with the state that are very, very hard to bridge, even for democratic governments. But without deep accommodative strategies, they don't go away. And so you get this kind of low-level violence or even seeming normalization, but unless these conflicts are addressed more directly and with some degree of negotiation, they tend to just linger and stay there and remain deep. In the case of Papua is illustrative of this for sure. Democracy does allow credibility of commitments made from constitutional guarantees to stable institutions that strengthen group autonomy. So in many cases, we can see those results, but it requires more oftentimes to increase that credibility, because in many cases, even constitutional guarantees and even autonomy legislation can be undermined by the state, as we see again in Papua, the ability to pass autonomy, at the same time divide the province and divide the group in ways that undermine its capacity to continue channeling its demands effectively. So that's it. That's my presentation for today, and a bit of a glimpse into this book.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jacques, for this wonderful presentation. I learned so much, and it helped to remind me why I find this venue so valuable at times like this, because I get to engage with important questions in new ways. Before we turn it over to Veronika for her remarks, I'd like to also offer an apology. I forgot one of our sponsors. This is also sponsored, and we are also thankful for the support of the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies, which is our third partner in supporting IS4. So my apologies. Over to Veronika. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pepinski. Thank you so much, Professor Bertrand. This is just a privilege for me, to respond to the book. And I have followed Professor Bertrand's book since 2004, where he talked about nationalism and ethnic conflict. And I think like this book like really made a very important contribution, and I really appreciate that Professor Bertrand or the book uses the word nationalist, and I think it's really is better reflect the sentiment and claim that this non-state actor make against post-colonial state actors. So it's really, I think the book challenges the predominant conception of nationalism that we understand like very strong in literature of Southeast Asia. So I really like that. I really appreciate that. I think the second point is that the book focuses on at least like 3 countries in Southeast Asia: Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines, and it lent itself as a to a comparative project, something that maybe anthropologists like me is not really invested in. So I like. Especially the closing chapter of the book about the exit and reframe chapter. I think that really offer a very important intervention in how secessionist conflict in the region can find a kind of like resolution or some sort of like the reduction of level of violence. And I really like that the Philippines like offer at least to Indonesia a lot of example in which the state concession and then respect and then legal instrument that they offer to nationalist movement, not only to the Cordilleran but also to Bangsa Moro, so the Moro nation. I think that's something that Indonesia hasn't really thought about, like that using the term like nation for Papua really will change the frame of the conversation. And I think the third point is about democratization. I think it's really interesting in the case of Indonesia because Professor Bertrand talk about how democratic regime, I quote here, create conditions that reduce nationalist violence but rarely succeed in channeling conflict through democratic institutions. And I would like to share my screen here just to show how that work in West Papua. So here from a different organization, I got the data that actually from 1998 and 2014, there has been ebb and flow of level of violence or separatist related incident and death. And we can see that during the transition, what Professor Bertrand has transitioned, the casualty is was quite high. But then the recent report by Gajah Mada University in 2021 shows that the level of violence is increasing, especially after 2017. And the most interesting thing about this data is also that the military casualty, so the Indonesian casualty is actually higher and higher than the OPM or the nationalist, the Papuan Independence Organization. That data is also supported by research by ICP, which shows that during 2017 and 2021, actually, that the number of armed cases increases from 24 in 2017 to like now between 2021 is between 90 to 137. My research also showed that instead of a reduction of a deployment, actually the Indonesian government sent more troops to West Papua. So for instance, from Victoriemo version in 2019, this is during the anti-racism protest, that Indonesia sent around 10,000. But from my research, it's about 17,192. So this is what called BKO or the inorganic troops that were deployed, for instance, for 9 months, but some stay like longer. So in regard to the level of violence and then the deployment of troops, I think the West Papuan case is very interesting here. And I bring this case, I think West Papua, not only because I do research here, but also West Papua may offer us an opportunity to reflect on the relationship between democratization and nationalism and violence. So from the recent estimation that we have, the current ratio of security forces to people in West Papua is about 12, which is very high. I mean, and it's higher even during the Aceh in 2003 and 2004, which was during military emergency or darurat militer. The TNI themselves, they plan to increase the number of security forces to West Papua by building more CODIP. And actually the recruitment is ongoing. And we estimate, or I estimate, at least by 2024, that there will be 14.5 security forces per 1,000 people. So if you see here that there has been an intensification and building of Indonesian military capacity in West Papua since 2017 or 2018. And this is in contrast, I think, in contrast with the claim of for instance, the autonomy status law that plan to improve the welfare of the Papuan, for instance, because security forces, the ratio of security forces per people is so much higher than, for instance, the ratio of doctor to population. So actually, I showed this data to say several things. First, that as Professor Bertrand says, that violence is endemic in some areas, especially in West Papua, but we can see that there is an intensification of violence since at least 2017, with increasing casualties among the Indonesian security forces. Second, that the violence is no longer concentrated in the highland, which is the traditional area of Papuan independent movement, but also spread to new areas like Maibrat in the coastal area of West Papua. So these two phenomena can point to what the many political scientists call as a rollback of Indonesian democracy, or the backsliding of Indonesian democracy, or that West Papua is an exception in this case, that in West Papua there or in West Papua there is anything but democracy. But third, it can also point to the political economy of Indonesian democratization that relies on the continuing exploitation of West Papuan resources that necessitate the continuing securitization and authoritarian form of governance. So I think this analysis on West Papua indicate several things broadly. First, that Indonesia has gone through two phases of democratization, transition and then stability to democratization, but West Papua is an exception. Second, that Indonesian democracy, or any democracy, really cannot be understood in terms of the linear progress of development or process, or in other words, that there is really no teleology of progress for democracy. So I think it's worth reflecting here whether the relationship between democracy and nationalism is also or can be understood as a more dynamic process in which the historicity of democratization can accommodate terms like rollback or backsliding of democracy, or some sort of exception here. So I would like to close my my presentation or respond with that question, because I think Professor Bertrand has posed a very interesting question about how democratization may lead to a better relationship between the state and nationalist group. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Veronika, for your comments here. In the interest of time, I'm going to turn this over to our question and answer. I'll remind everybody of the norms of how this works. You type your question in the Q&A box, and then I'll read it out for the audience. Our first question comes from Deka Anwar. You focus more on PDP leadership than on other facets of the decision-making process. And Deka asks that this group no longer proposes or has so much influence among Papuan youths. I'd like to ask you on the collective action of the self-determination activists and combatants. What do you think about the evolution of insurgent groups, particularly with the division between, there's a couple of acronyms, KNPB, ULMWP, and TPNPB. I don't know what those stand for, apologies. Do you think that Papuan self-determination movement can overcome inherent tribal, factional, regional fault lines that have prevented OPM from being a cohesive and modern organization? A lot to cover there. I apologize, Jacques.
Okay, so let me answer that question and then maybe say something about Veronika's comments, because I'm sure others would like to have some questions as well. So yeah, I focus on PDP because I think, there really was, to this day, it remains the moment in which Papuans seem to have, in a very brief time period, had managed to overcome a lot of divisiveness that is inherent in Papua, and they were able to come up with a fairly strong consensus around the leadership. It continues to evolve. The last few years, I will confess, I haven't been in Papua during the last 2-3 years, so things are evolving. But structurally, I see the same things at work. Papuans have difficulty with unity. Everybody says it in Papua. The churches have been trying to play a leadership role. They never were able to agree on, providing an alternative to the PDP. The DAP had its moment. It went too far, and it really had problems replacing the PDP. Now you get a proliferation of different groups. It is challenging. I think the difference as well is that the state's policies have continued to divide and dilute Papuan interests, and that makes it even harder. And that has been part of the strategy from the beginning. So the point I'm trying to make, I'm not Papuan unity, but there was a moment, right, of investment in the congresses that allowed that possibility. What is certainly clear to me, though, is that what democracy has allowed, for better or worse, and this is for worse in Papua, it has allowed even more centers of interest to multiply. So you now have an elite that does have an interest in the special autonomy bill. You have people who have contributed to dividing the province, new regencies, 2 provinces, and they have vested interests. So those authorities are also contributing to the division, not just from the mobilization of land. So it is a challenge, and I would say something that, of course, structurally means it's always going to be difficult to leverage enough mobilization to get the kinds of gains that Papuans want in comparative perspective, right? When I compare with other groups, and that's why the Indonesian government has, in part, been continued to be able to get away with not conceding very much in the last few years, even though it's promising for dialogue, because it could exploit that situation. But part of this, and this is linked to Veronika's first comment about exit and reframe, something I didn't mention, and that has to do with the Cordillera case, which is interesting because nobody focuses on the Cordillera in the Philippines. But what they did is that they went from being a nationalist group asking for autonomy to one, they then shifted and became leaders of the indigenous peoples movement, which led to IPRA, which led to a different way of defining self-determination, which was less threatening to the state. And in some ways, we can discuss at length as to whether that actually led to true differences for Cordillerans. But it's coming back to this notion that as soon as a group articulates its grievances in nationalist terms, and in Papua, it cannot be deeper, right? I mean, there's rejection of the integration of Papuans to Indonesia from the outset. That is the cornerstone. That gap is so difficult to overcome that it explains a lot of this deepening conflict even under democratic rule, right? So the backsliding doesn't help. I'll get to that in a moment. But there's also just the depth of that gap means that the Indonesian government has a very, very strong constituency behind it, majority, that just is not ready to what they see as a threat of these nationalists, right? You concede more to Papua, they'll want independence. And so that's what's the elite in Jakarta can keep nurturing as a way of justifying repression in ways that in other cases doesn't happen. And so that you know, it's just my analytical lens, not my normative one, right? Just showing how difficult it is in this particular case. So, and I'm not going to pretend that, you know, once democratic stability and the kinds of mechanisms I've outlined sort of set in, that this becomes a static, forever kind of process, right? I look at certain few years. I think, and I agree with most of you, part of what's going on after 2017 is this general democratic backsliding. That does mean that the state starts using more repressive capacity across the board, not just in Papua, and gets away with it. That's very different. That means something else is going on. It's no longer, then, you know, I would need to refine this to say this is no longer the period of democratic stability. It's something else going on. It's shifting back towards authoritarianism, which changes the dynamic completely. Anyways, I'll stop there because I'm sure there are other questions.
Thank you. Our next question is from Calvin Ho, and I'm going to remind everybody we've got 6 more minutes, so I'll try to be as brief as possible. How do you view the so-called Papua special autonomy arrangements? Are they simply another elite politics, or still their early stages to provide incentives, recognition, and improvement for the Orang Asli Papua, for the people of Papua?
So the special autonomy arrangement was not negotiated with Papuans. It was, you know, in legislative terms, lots of power, lots of money, but Papuans, Orang Asli Papua, were never invested in it because they didn't negotiate it. It didn't address a lot of their needs, and so it became, you know, they work within it. They've taken advantage here and there of it, but it doesn't deliver what Papuans want because they never felt invested. This is the point about credibility of commitment, that unless there's some sort of aspect of having participated in the design, felt that this was responding to some of their grievances, not be potentially undermined or taken away parts of it over time, then, you know, there's very little that supports it. And so it's not surprising that even though in objective terms, there seem to have been a lot of fiscal allocations and powers, that it's been continuously undermined by Papuans themselves as well, because they weren't really invested in it. They don't want to give legitimacy to it, you know, because they didn't negotiate it. So that's part of the pernicious effect of unilateral concessions. Okay, I'm not going to go further, not many minutes left. Is there time for another question? Or?
Yes, there's time for another. And this one comes from Emir Khairola. I agree that democracy allows negotiation between elites, particularly during Habibie and Wahid presidencies, both in the Papua and Aceh case. However, at least one aspect that may be the reason why special autonomy has not been so successful in Papua, elites at the national level do not want to release their power for fear of losing control over natural resources. I guess this is more of a question. To what extent do you agree that the main issue in Papua is elites' unwillingness in Jakarta to relinquish political control over natural resources?
I think there's natural resources, but it's also a political fear of recognizing that the way in which Papua was integrated was wrong, and they need to, you know, renegotiate that. That's not something that's in the cards for Jakarta, and it's step number 1 for Papuans. So this is the deep gap I was talking about, and that's prior to the natural resources, which didn't help. Yeah.
I'd like to ask my own question, if I may, with the remaining time that we have. We're all concerned about democratic backsliding in Indonesia and around the world. I'd like to ask you, if I may, I'd like to invite you to speculate on what would be the consequences of democratic backsliding in Indonesia were it to continue further or take a more ominous turn for nationalist violence in the 2 cases that you've studied. Do you have any thoughts or expectations or or bold predictions that you can share with us?
Bold predictions, coming from a political scientist who knows rule number one, we try not to engage in speculation. And then, so put me on the spot, have me predict what will happen with backsliding. Well, bad news for Papua, obviously it opens up, there is just no compromise there. If the regime becomes more authoritarian, I think the trends that Veronika is pointing, will just continue. There'll be more securitization in Papua. And that, I think, would not be surprising. The more interesting, I shouldn't say, but in Aceh, it depends. I mean, Aceh has been functioning pretty well despite all the the setbacks. But authoritarianism does create setbacks. The good news for Aceh is that oil and gas is disappearing, so there's little natural resource interest in regaining central government control over Aceh. So they can possibly continue to function. There will be less democratic representation in Aceh potentially. That will create its own local problems. But in terms of the relationship to Jakarta, it may not refuel any kind of insurgent response or need from the state's perspective to increase its repressive strategy in Aceh. Okay, there's my bold prediction.
Fantastic. We are just about out of time, so I want to thank Jacques Bertrand for this wonderful presentation and discussion. I cannot wait to read the book. I have not done so yet, but it's on my list. I also want to thank
you, Veronika. Thank you, everybody. Yes.
I want to thank Veronika as well for the really thoughtful commentary. And once again, our thanks to the Sydney Southeast Asia Center, the Cornell Southeast Asia Program, and KITLFA in Leiden for their support and the infrastructure backstopping for making this work. Before I let you go, I just want to preview our next event, which will be happening overnight, March 31st versus April 1st. And it'll be a presentation by Naila Shofia from Yale and US entitled "Why Veil Religious Headscarves and the Public Role of Women." I look forward to seeing you all there then. Thank you again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. And thanks again, Jacques.